Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for being here with us today. I know you're going to be glad you took the time to join us. We have a lot of wonderful information from our wonderful speaker. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Rita Wolfson. Our topic today is financial and policy support for newly arrived refugees. And our speaker is Anna Zonderman. And I've learned so much from her already, and you will too. And I'm going to go ahead and when I turn over the presentation to Anna, she can tell you more about herself and her work. Answers to the most commonly asked questions, along with some suggestions. If you've never joined us before, you can check the chat box for messages that we have for you. The slides aren't shared, they are proprietary, but the recording will be emailed to you. It will also be up on the website, our Facebook page, and our YouTube channel in the next day or so. If you have questions, just type them into the question box and we will answer as many as time permits. There are no CEs or certificates of attendance for this webinar, just a lot of great content for everyone, lots of good learning. And if you should have any technical issues, this is the link, and Olga will put that link into the chat box also. Okay, I like to begin our monthly free webinar with our financial social work affirmation because I feel that it captures what my work is all about in financial social work. So just for today, I will love myself enough to face my fears, practice self-acceptance, and embrace hope. I will silence my inner critic, speak my truth, and make peace with myself and with my past. Just for today, I will give myself permission to eliminate toxic people, beliefs, and behaviors from my life. And just for today, I will prepare for a better tomorrow by healing my relationship with my money and myself today. So let's get started. I have one poll for you today, and I'm going to put that up. Launch it. I guess I have to pick it first. Okay. So, what is your most pressing financial concern today? There's a lot more that could be included on this list, but we only get 5 options. I certainly would have added inflation, because most of these increasing expenses are sadly due to inflation, which from everything I read, looks like it will only continue to increase. Okay, so only 50% of you have voted. Anybody else want to contribute? Let's go ahead if you want to. Okay. And I'm going to then close this poll. We got to over 70%, and I will share it with you. And you could see that if you wanted to share any other concerns, you could put those in the chat box. So the majority of you are concerned about credit card debt, student loans, medical debt, very understandable. Healthcare costs right up there next to daily expenses. those daily expenses just keep getting more and more expensive. And perhaps at the end, if we have the time, we can talk a little bit more about that. So that's my poll for today. Anna will have some for you in a little while. So let's keep going. No one chooses to have money problems, but most people do. I find it so powerful, and I wish so much that it wasn't the truth, but it is. And you know that money is always the elephant in the room. And that's because it's about so much more than dollars, cents, debt, math, budgets, and crisis intervention. And for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, and those of you who join us regularly, you know, that's where financial social work fits. We look at mental health, we look at physical health, we talk about money, talk about self-care. So we come in at the intersection of social work, politics, the economy, gender, economic, and social justice, and all financial inequity. This is a list of some of the places and some of the ways that we know some of us and many of our clients are struggling. The core of my work in financial social work addresses our relationship with money and our relationship with self. It's about healing those two very critical relationships. So we explore the fundamentals of financial health. That psychosocial piece. We look at those thoughts, feelings, attitudes, beliefs, experiences, and values. And they're so important because that's what we determines how we earn, spend, save, share, and borrow. And that is our financial behavior. It's always about our financial behavior. It is a behavioral model. And that's because until and unless behavior changes, nothing changes. It incorporates the radical model of change with pre-contemplation and the various pieces that follow. And that's how we help clients to change. It's interactive, reflective, strengths-based, educational, motivational, supportive. My work is holistic, multidisciplinary, and healing. It's helpful, and changes individuals' lives and the lives of those in groups. And the process is about healing relationship with money by recognizing and taking ownership of financial health personally and with clients, and healing relationship with self-discovery, self-care, self-healing, helping people understand that self-care isn't selfish. It's all about self. And so I am going to go ahead and turn this over to Anna so she can share all of her wisdom with you. Ready, Anna?
Yes, I am ready.
Great. Okay, great.
Okay. Hopefully you can see my slides.
There you go. Okay, great.
And here we go. Okay. Thanks, Rita, for inviting me to do this. I think when we originally planned this 6 months ago, we didn't know quite how timely this topic would be. So we're we're going to talk a little bit today about the refugee sort of situation broadly in the US. I am going to spend a bit of time talking about what's going on in Afghanistan because it's been in the news a lot. But for the most part, I'm going to be speaking sort of broadly about the refugee resettlement system in the US and some of the financial implications for newly arrived refugee individuals and families. We're going to start just with a few important terms and concepts because the terminology that gets used in the international space to talk about refugees overlaps but is not exactly the same as the terminology that is used in US policy. So I just want to make sure we're all clear about what we're talking about so that everyone is on the same page. And then I'm just going to quickly review sort of the basics of the refugee resettlement system in the US, and then we'll get into financial challenges, considerations for people who are supporting refugees, either as community members or as professionals, and then some ideas for how the system can be improved, how we can bring financial social work into refugee resettlement and hopefully provide better outcomes in terms of families feeling and being financially stable as they adjust to their new lives in the US. So, first poll. So this answer changes throughout time, but recently, what do you think has been the largest group of refugees resettled in the US? Where are they coming from? Okay, we've got a little bit over 50%. So I'm just going to give a few more seconds if you'd like to contribute your answer.
Anna, may I interrupt a little while people are voting? When you back to your presentation, go to the slideshow view. So we will see your slides without, because I think we didn't see your second slide.
Okay. In mine, it looks like it's in the slideshow view, but I'll try again. Okay. So I'm not surprised that most people said Middle East and North Africa. In fact, in the last few years, it's actually been sub-Saharan Africa. And mostly this is because of policies under the Trump administration that limited the ability of people who are Muslim to come to the US as refugees. There are certainly Muslim refugees in all three of these areas of the world, but the majority of refugees coming from the Middle East and North Africa are of Muslim background. And so the statistics changed pretty dramatically in the past few years. Okay, I'm gonna try again can you see my slide now? It should say important terms and concepts.
No, it's first slide.
Okay. Because on mine, it says that it's in presentation mode, but let me see if I can just start again.
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay. Nope. Okay. So we're going to just quickly, like I said, review a few terms so that everyone is kind of on the same page about the different groups of immigrants who may be considered refugees in different parts of the world and how that translates into who is called a refugee when they're actually in the United States. It's a little bit different. So refugees generally in the sort of international definition are people who have had to cross an international border for their safety, either escaping war or persecution or political upheaval, and then feel that they are unable to return to their country because they have a well-founded fear of being targeted or persecuted for any number of reasons. And you'll see in some of these early slides that there are some little numbers at the bottom. Those are to coordinate the information with my references, which are at the end of the presentation, and I think Olga will share those in the chat. So if anyone wants to go through and dig through these definitions a little bit more on your own time, you're welcome to. So the process for refugees coming to the US, and this is where it gets a little confusing, is that refugees are, they're going through these sort of screening procedures and the determination of whether or not they can seek protection in the US before they actually arrive in the country. So they have crossed a border out to leave their home country, and then either in that neighboring country or in another country, if they sort of travel on by foot or by other means, they then will register with the United Nations as a refugee and request that they be resettled in the United States. And then there are procedures that involve interviews and medical checks and all sorts of clearances through different government departments, and all of that happens before they arrive here. For refugees who have come into the US through that channel, they are traveling to the US on a refugee visa that's good for about a year. And then at the end of that year, they're required to do something called adjusting their status, which means that they will then get a green card. And they are considered permanent residents from the moment that they arrive in the United States. But because they're traveling with the refugee visa and because it's good for a year, they kind of keep it for that first 9 to 12 months, and then they apply for their green card. But the green card is backdated to the day that they arrived in the US. So they already have 1 year of permanent residence sort of under their belt at that time. And at the end of 5 years of permanent residence, so 4 years after they adjust their status to the green card, they're eligible to apply for citizenship. Asylum is a slightly different but related concept. So refugees who travel across a border to leave their country and then are seeking protection are all seeking asylum, whether it is in a neighboring country to their home country or in a European country or in the United States or elsewhere. It's all the process of seeking asylum. And everyone who is eligible for asylum under international law is a refugee. They're all people who have had to leave their country because of war or persecution or political upheaval, and they have this well-founded fear that they will not be safe if they return. So asylum seekers coming to the US have a slightly different trajectory. They are applying for protection, not before they arrive in the US, but either at the border, and this is most commonly seen at the Mexico-US border, although it does happen at the Canada-US border as well, or it happens in the United States. So there are people who are able to get a tourist visa, for example, to get out of their country, and they fly here or they arrive on a boat with a visa that allows them to enter, and then they will overstay that visa, and they're allowed, I believe, a 5 or 7 month grace period after their visa expires to apply for asylum. So there are, and then there are also people who are able to get a travel visa. Maybe it's only for a week, depending on what country they're coming from. Travel visas often have really significant restrictions on them. But these are people maybe who already know that they have a good case for asylum and they don't want to risk overstaying the visa, or some folks who overstay their visas make that decision when they're here. They haven't done it ahead of time. But there are folks who will arrive at an airport in particular and seek out an official, a police officer or an immigration officer, and ask for asylum right there in the airport. So that's sort of the third pathway. So once someone is granted asylum, once their case is approved, they are called an asylee. And then, similar to refugees, from the date that they are granted asylum, they will have a permanent resident card that's sort of backdated 1 year. Often asylum cases take many years to complete. So there is a certain level of protection granted to people who have done the application, but the application is still pending. But there's still quite a bit of uncertainty until you're actually granted asylee status. And once you are granted that status, it's about another 4 years until you can apply for citizenship. And lastly, I wanted to include a slide to sort of explain the status of people who are coming from Afghanistan, because that is the sort of refugee story of the day. So evacuees are people who have been removed from a country for their own safety by a government. And in the case of the United States, this very, very rarely happens. So the fact that not only US citizens and green card holders, but other citizens of Afghanistan who do not have an existing sort of residential tie to the United States are being airlifted out in huge numbers is very, very unusual. What's particularly complicated about the situation for Afghan evacuees is that depending on who they are and their background, they are eligible for different types of protection in the US. So some of the people who have been able to get out were partially through their clearance for something called a special immigrant visa, which is granted to people who work with the United States military, either in Afghanistan or Iraq. And they, when they sign up to assist, either as translators or as engineers or whatever their role is, part of the agreement is that they and their families will be granted a visa to live in the United States when their service is finished. So there were a lot of people who were who had wrapped up their service. They were in the process of getting cleared for their visas, and then the US military pulled out of Afghanistan and they were able to get out, but they can't just walk into the United States yet because they don't have an actual visa, they have a pending visa. So there are individuals and families on many of the US military bases in the US and also in other parts of the world who are sort of in this limbo status, and the government now has to finish clearing them, finish going through that process so that they can give them those visas and then allow them to move on to the resettlement stage. There are also people who were unaffiliated with the military who have managed to leave, and they are sort of in this asylum seeking category. So they have to go through the process of getting cleared, and it is being done in an expedited way because our government evacuated everyone. They now have to, figure out how to categorize each person who's on one of the military bases and move them to the right type of support. And so it's happening, I think, as fast as it can, but it is a huge number of people. There are thousands and thousands of people on these military bases, and everyone needs to be sort of identified and make sure that they are safe to travel to the next step. If there are people who have family in this country, they're trying to get people reconnected with their family members, which is sometimes pretty easy to do, but not always. And of course, because of the speed at which this happened, there are families who have been split up over different military bases. So, if part of a family was able to get out on one plane, but the rest of the family wasn't able to get out until the next week, they may be split in half or, in different military bases. And so people are not only trying to reconnect with family who are already here, but reconnect with family who evacuated at different points during this process. So it's very, very complicated. It's actually sort of put a halt on the entire refugee resettlement system for a few weeks while everyone sorts this out, because there are just so many people, and it's really important that everybody is identified and is safe. There are also, of course, COVID restrictions to consider. Everyone is being offered a vaccination, which they're not required to take, but for people who do want to get vaccinated, they want to make sure that that if they don't feel well after the vaccination, that they're being cared for. And there was also a measles outbreak in one of the military bases, and so there's now been a push to make sure that everyone is vaccinated for measles. And once that happens, there's also a waiting period. Once that vaccination has been given, I believe they're asking people to wait for 3 weeks on the military base while that vaccine sort of is taken up in everyone's bodies. So all of these things are creating a huge amount of confusion and delays and complications. But again, this is a very unusual situation. So it's not typically how the refugee resettlement system works. Okay, so here is our second poll. How long does it take on average for refugees to complete the procedures that allow them to travel to the US? So this is refugees who are applying for protection outside of the United States before they travel here. We have a little over 50% participating, so I'll give it a few more seconds if you'd like to take a guess. Okay. So about half of you who participated guessed correctly. On average, it takes 18 months to 3 years to go through the clearance procedures. It certainly can take longer than that. So for those of you who said 4 or more years, that is not typical, but it definitely happens. And for those of you who said that it was less time than 18 months, I think all of us who work in this space would love if that was true, but it basically never happens, unfortunately. So this is just a graphic to sort of show the different steps involved in that clearance process for those who are applying for protection outside of the US. And the 18-month to 3-year clock really starts at step 2 once the referral to the US has been made. So there is often a long period of time, depending on where a person is, between registering with the United Nations and being referred for resettlement in the US. That itself can take many, many years, depending on the nature of the conflict and where people are located. But the clock really starts at that referral process to the US, and then that's when the security clearances begin and the interviews begin, and there are medical screenings and all sorts of other steps that people have to go through. Okay, this next graphic is just sort of a different way of kind of showing the different steps, but also provides a little bit more insight into what happens once people actually arrive in the United States. So there's the security section on the left side of the graphic is all of the stuff that kind of happens outside of the US. Placement is partially happening before people arrive, but then once they are actually on the ground in the US, there's this 30 to 90 day period called reception and placement, which is sort of the critical period during which people are connected with resources and support to help them adjust to their new life. And I think many of us who work with refugees feel that this is not nearly long enough. It's certainly usually long enough to get the basics in place, so to get people connected with public benefits, to get children registered for school, to get adults and children into English language learning opportunities, whether that's ESL classes or tutoring or whatever is available depending on where in the country they are resettled and how those services work in each particular community. It's also usually enough time to get people connected with medical insurance and to get some of the deferred health care situations taken care of. A lot of times when refugees arrive in the US, they have not had consistent or adequate medical care for a very long time. So even people who are generally healthy often have a parasitic infection or something that just happened in the period when they didn't have good access to care and needs to be taken care of. Often this is the period of time when we find out that, for example, somebody needs glasses and they didn't know. So the 30 to 90 days can be a really important period of time for just getting those basic things sort of situated. But in terms of long-term stability, and certainly in terms of feeling financially stable and independent, it just is not enough time. So next, I'm just going to go through some of the challenges that I see as being most important to financial stability. Language and culture is, of course, a huge one. I think if you recall the beginning of the presentation, there was Rita's slide with the elephant on it. Money and financial matters are the elephant in the room always, in this country, and that is true in many other cultures. So then add to this language barriers and the fact that you are suddenly in a place where you don't know anyone or you don't really know how things work. Finances is not exactly a comfortable topic to discuss. In addition, there are a lot of great tools out there to help with money management, to help people develop financial skills, but the vast majority of them are in English or maybe in Spanish, but that certainly does not account for all of the other languages that refugees speak. So it's pretty rare that there is a good resource that's already in one of the many languages that it might need to be translated into, especially because some refugees are coming from places where they speak a very uncommon language, where there's really only people from one region of a country who speak that language. So while it's certainly not, it doesn't seem unusual that there wouldn't be resources available in that language. It is really a hindrance for people when they arrive here to not have those resources available to them in a language they can understand. And beyond that, refugees are coming from all sorts of backgrounds. So some have quite a bit of education, some have very little or no formal education. And so not only might you find yourself in a situation where you're working with a refugee who doesn't speak English, but it's also possible that they're not literate or have very limited literacy in their own language. So in a situation like that, you know, a written resource really isn't going to be very helpful. And that's often where people who work with refugees have to get really creative about how they help people develop new skills in financial matters and across the board. Education versus employment is a huge tension in that 30 to 90 day period of reception and placement, and also for the first many, many years that refugees are here. It may, in fact, really always be a tension. Because government support that is provided for refugees doesn't last all that long necessarily. It can be extended depending on different family circumstances, but it's not guaranteed right off the bat. There is this push to get at least one member of the family working as quickly as possible. Often that's being driven by the resettlement agency, but it's also often driven by the families themselves. I think I myself have very often been asked, you know, moments after a family arrives in the apartment where they're going to be staying, how much does this cost? So people are very aware that there is a need to support themselves, and they are really quick to jump into employment versus holding off a little while to really try to develop their English skills. Unfortunately, down the road, what then happens is that it's hard to be employed and then also be doing sort of formal English education. People do often learn some English on the job, which is always really useful. But it's hard to have the energy or the time to really study English if you're working to support your family and you're working in a low-wage job. And then you sort of get into this cycle where not knowing enough of the language or not being able to progress in education sort of limits the types of employment that you can get moving forward. And so there's always going to be this pull to work more, work more, work more. And that makes it increasingly challenging to then, you know, progress in English beyond a certain point, and possibly to go back to school and be able to get the training or degrees that would allow you to have a more financially stable job in the future. And then there's also the pervasive US debt and credit system. So in order to travel to the United States, refugees are granted a travel loan that pays for their plane tickets, and they are then asked to pay it back. It's not done immediately, so the payback in this sort of pros section, the payback does happen slowly over several years, and it's deferred for the first 6 months after someone arrives. So it's not like an immediate expense that people have, but it is sort of looming for many people. The other good things about this system are that it creates an opportunity to build a credit history and establish a credit score, which is important for families to then be able to, you know, rent a different apartment than the one that they were provided upon arrival, to buy a car, all sorts of things where having a credit score is important. And really, because often people are arriving as adults, sometimes older adults, with no credit history or credit score, the travel loan payback is really the only way to establish credit. So that is, although it's a really difficult situation to put people in, that is an upside. The other thing that's helpful is the institutions that manage the payback are very accommodating. So for people who have a significant health condition, an adult or child, they'll often write off the cost of that individual's travel loan. They will also very readily reduce payments for people who contact them or are assisted in contacting them to say, like, you know, there's 2 adults or 3 adults in this family who can work, but only one of us is working right now, so we don't have a lot of flexible income. Or you know, we arrived here as a family of 4 and now we're expecting our next child, and so you know, we have these additional financial considerations. So there is some flexibility there in terms of when and how much people are paying back those loans. The downsides, of course, is that this is, you know, yet another bill to pay for families who do not have a lot of financial flexibility at all. It's also another agency to update if you're moving to a new home. So one thing that happens is that people are sort of partway through paying back their loan, and then they move to a different apartment and they don't get their next bill. And then all of a sudden they've lost track of that payment. And unfortunately, if people do have outstanding payments at the end of those 3 years, the loan can go to collections. So that's certainly a risk that people who are working with refugees try to help them avoid, but it does happen. And I know it's devastating for a lot of families when something like that happens. And the last is, of course, the psychological impact of arriving in the US, where you're already you know, not understanding the language, not understanding the culture, not knowing where you are or how anything works, and you've got this debt hanging over your head immediately. So in that sense, it's certainly not an ideal system. It would be nice if there were other ways that refugees could build a credit history without having this loan, but that is one of the realities of the way that the system has been built to this point. Okay, I do our last poll. About how much per person is the travel loan that refugees have to pay back, do you think? Got about 50%, so I'll give it a few more seconds. Okay. So those of you who said a little over $1,000, you are correct. Typically, the travel to get from anywhere that a refugee is coming from to their final destination in the US is at least 2, if not more often 3 planes. So, and sometimes 4. So the travel loans are pretty expensive. Again, that's really the downside to all of this, is that it is so much money, even though some things about the way that that the loan is structured and the way that people pay it back is actually beneficial in the long run. It's a huge amount of money for large families in particular. I've worked with families who have 7 or 8 or 9 children. So you can imagine if you've got, you know, 1 or 2 parents and that many kids, and sometimes one of the older children in the family is married themselves and may have another child, and you know, the total cost for the family can be really astronomical. and it's a very overwhelming thing to have sort of looming when you arrive here. Okay, so now we're going to move into the last couple sections of the presentation, which are about things to think about, and from that, ideas for promoting better outcomes in terms of financial stability. So whether someone is supporting a refugee or refugee family as an individual community member, as a neighbor, or whether this is a professional relationship that you have, I think these considerations sort of apply across the board. So the first is to be aware of trauma. Refugees have experienced an incredible amount of loss, even in the best of situations, and that comes in a number of forms. So it may not be the loss of family or friends, although it often is, but at the very least, it's loss of home. If not your physical home, then leaving your country and your culture behind in a lot of ways. Loss of businesses and livelihoods, physical possessions, and often any sort of savings, whether that was in the form of property that someone could that had value to it in that sense, or actual physical money. People often find themselves in situations where they have to use the money that they have access to get themselves out of the country that they're trying to flee, and or to survive in the country that they end up in before they are resettled. So it's unusual that people are coming to the US with any significant amount of money to their names. And so because of this, any conversations about finances can be quite triggering. Another consideration is to talk about money early and often. So I think that there is sometimes a tendency to tell a person or a family who's concerned about the money, especially for those of us who work closely to make sure that they have the resources that they need. We'll say, oh, it's okay, you don't have to worry about that right now. Like, we're going to make sure that everything is set up so that you have everything that you need, even though it's going to be difficult. Like, we're certainly not going to let you end up on the street. So, please don't worry about that. And that is often a conversation that's had with the best of intentions. But I think from my experience and the experience of others who I've worked with, actually starting out from the very beginning, talking about money and making that sort of a comfortable part of the relationship is really critical and can be a game changer. I think that for people who don't feel comfortable having that conversation in either direction, either as the person providing the support or as the person seeking the support, it can delay conversations, and it can land people in situations that are maybe more dire than they needed to be. Also, normalizing can be really powerful. So if you just sort of talk about these topics from the beginning and make it known that these are things that are important and that you're thinking about and that the other person should be thinking about, it's just easier in the future. And the last is that discussing important topics, whether they are financial or otherwise, can build confidence and competence for the folks who are trying to make their way here. So having an understanding of their finances and their financial situation can feel quite stabilizing, as opposed to maybe being reassured that you have support, but not understanding exactly what that means. Practicing anticipatory guidance. So by this, I mean that it's helpful to know what's coming. So this sort of connects back to the last one. There is government support that is provided to refugees when they arrive, but that doesn't last forever. So it's helpful to kind of know from the beginning what that's going to look like and what you can expect so that it's not a surprise. Providing context is also really important. So this all sort of connects together, but understanding why government support doesn't last forever and what it's designed to do. There are pluses and minuses to everything in this system. So certainly not ideal, but the understanding the relationship between the assistance that you get from the government versus like what changes when you start to work, for example, it's really helpful to sort of understand how all of this fits together. And then using visual aids, so this gets back to the issue of language. It's really helpful to not have everything sort of rely on words, and both for English language learning and also just because there's a lot of information that people have to remember when they first arrive here. It's nice to have easy ways to recall that information, and often visual aids can be a really nice way to do that. And then getting documents translated whenever possible. So for people who do have literacy skills in their own language, sometimes you can request that documents be shared in certain languages. It's not a guarantee for all languages. It's different in different parts of the country, what's available. So if possible, finding a way to get important information translated so that people can keep track of it in the way that's most comfortable for them. And then really quickly to wrap up, just a couple of ideas for how we can do better to support people's financial stability and financial skills in this type of situation. So, designing materials that can assist refugees in learning basic financial skills, whether that's things that are mostly visual or things in a variety of different languages. There are people who are just part of the community in many parts of the country who speak all sorts of languages. There are folks at universities who can translate documents. So creating partnerships to provide some of these tools in languages that are more accessible can go a long way. And then finally, bringing financial social work into refugee communities. So this could be in the form of hiring staff at resettlement agencies who have financial social work training, or better yet, I would say identifying people in refugee communities who have the skills and the personality and the will to kind of learn these skills, master these skills, and then turn around and be able to teach them to others in their communities. So kind of a community health worker model, I think, is probably one of the most sustainable ways to make this a more integrated part of the refugee resettlement experience. These are the references, and we have a few minutes left for questions.
Anna, I'm going to go ahead and take the presentation back. So that before we do the Q&A, I just share with everyone something very near and dear to my heart and important in financial social work and working with refugees and all families, is to prepare your child for the real world by teaching them about money and not letting them go off into the world to make more financial mistakes than necessary. And for those of you who may be new to our monthly free webinar, I wanted you to know that next month, our speaker will be talking on discovering your inner social work entrepreneur. And in December, we'll finish the year with addressing financial grief. You can register for those on the Financial Social Work website. We've introduced last month an exciting new program of online meetups for helping professionals. They are free to anyone in this audience and to other social workers and professionals who want to talk about money. They grew out of the monthly free webinar last month that I titled and presented on social workers and money. We need to talk about it. And so on a monthly basis, we are continuing these discussions and dialogues. I want you all to know that we have a financial social work certification. It is self-study and self-paced. Our students have 6 months to complete it. It includes all of the materials and the final exam, which is an open book, and students have 2 weeks to complete. It also includes a monthly Zoom meeting of what we call our Financial Social Work Professional Network. And we also have a Facebook and LinkedIn group, and it includes 20 CEUs from National NASW. And I'd like you all to remember that clients overwhelmed by financial problems, stress, anxiety, and trauma they didn't know how to prevent and have no idea how to fix are unable to learn, improve, or practice new money skills. And that's why we have financial social work. So I would like to thank Anna Sonderman, and I think we can take a few minutes anyway if you have some questions for us, Olga. But Anna, thank you. What a wonderful presentation. You covered so much content. And I've thought about the fact also, as you said at the beginning of your presentation, that when we started planning this 6 months ago, we couldn't possibly know how timely it would be. And you really did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, first question. Do evacuees have an ITIN or SSI so they can access banking?
So everyone who is coming in through the sort of evacuee situation, my understanding is going to be getting a social security number, which is something that refugees are eligible for, and asylum seekers, once they reach a certain point in their asylum process, are also eligible for. So yes, I don't know exactly how that's going to work, but my understanding is that that is going to be part of the process for everybody.
Okay, thank you. The Haitian who came to the US, were they able to seek asylum?
I think it depends on the situation. That's not, asylum is not a process that I'm as familiar with. And I know that there are a lot of particularities, and it's not always about the country that you're coming from or the situation in the country broadly. So there can be people from who are seeking asylum who don't get granted asylum, and others who do because of more personal situations. So there, for example, are people whose asylum claim is centered around being part of the LGBTQ community, and that those folks might be more in danger than someone who's not from that community, who's coming from the same country, regardless of the other stuff that's going on in the country. So I don't know that I have a straightforward answer to that, but I could certainly look into it.
Mm-hmm. What type of financial support do refugees get when they arrive in the US?
So refugees are eligible for Medicaid health insurance, as well as SNAP, so food stamps, and then some sort of cash assistance. It's different depending on whether you are a family with children under 18, or if you're a single adult, or an adult in a pair but without children. So there are different rules for different people, and that both changes the amount of the cash assistance and how long you have access to it. So it can vary quite a bit.
Okay, thank you. Are Afghan evacuees eligible for the same financial support as refugees?
So the answer, I think, still is it depends, because every couple of days they're changing the rules. There was about a week ago, it wasn't clear that all evacuees were going to be eligible for health insurance, but now they are. So that's sort of an evolving situation. And I think if anyone's interested in that, there's a lot being reported in the news at the moment. So I would follow along there.
Okay, thank you. What type of information do refugees get about finance and financial support before they arrive in the US?
So refugees have to go through a cultural orientation at the sort of the second to last stage before they actually arrive in the US. And there are some broad financial topics that are covered in that curriculum, but they're pretty limited. And so often it's hard to retain that information when you've got so many other things to worry about when you've actually arrived here. But also sometimes that information is very general, and it actually sort of being in the situation and understanding what financial support looks like can be much more useful to people. So sometimes you have a sense before you get here, but it's not nearly as in-depth as it could be.
Okay, the next question is a little long, and so do we have time still, Rita? Can I ask a few more questions?
Anna, you have another 3 minutes or so?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, go ahead.
So, have you heard of resettlement offices working with the staff of the federally funded Senior Community Service Employment Program to enroll refugees in resettlement program and this program?
Not specifically. I know that in different places, resettlement workers have different relationships with state and federal and local programs that people are eligible for. So there is a bare minimum of support that people are required to receive, and that the resettlement workers have to make sure that people get connected to. But a lot of times there are other programs that people might be eligible for that are not part of that sort of basic package, and either people are kind of left to find those programs on their own, or if they're working with a community group or a neighborhood organization that's helping them out, some of those connections happen at that stage as well. So I'm not specifically familiar with that being like a standard practice, but I think it should be.
Okay, so I'm asking because the two next question was related to this, so I probably wouldn't ask you.
Okay.
Yeah, and next question, are there resources to help the divide between language and the inability to read, write?
There are programs for people to learn English, speaking, reading, and writing. And it is a requirement that refugees get connected to English language learning programs. But it's also, again, it's hard to keep up with that type of learning if you're starting to go to work quickly. So for kids, regardless of their literacy level, when they arrived, they'll get enrolled in school and they'll pick up those skills often in school. Sometimes people who are working in certain types of jobs will learn sort of basic literacy skills, even, if it's just their name and the date and things like that as adults. But it's really a challenge, and a lot of it is sort of individually directed, depending on your time and inclination to squeeze in yet another stressful thing into your life. So there are certainly a lot of ways in which I think we could do more there.
Okay,
Okay.
last question, Olga. Do you have one more?
Last question, and it's a more practical question, I think. I got resettled 3 months ago from Malawi. How to find a job related to my education and work experience?
Oh, good question. I think there are a few things that I might recommend. One would be to find out if your education sort of translates directly. So if you have a degree or a certification that is usable here, that's wonderful, but unfortunately that's not always the case. Sometimes people have to go back to school to get recertified. So that would be one thing to look into. But I think if there isn't a resettlement agency that's helpful, I might look for a community center or a university or some other agency that kind of helps people navigate community resources, because they might be able to point you in the direction of different types of job opportunities.
Well, you certainly have answers for a lot of questions, Anna. Just thank you so much. So many people have said thank you in the chat box or question box, and we're most appreciative of your sharing with us today. So thanks again, and I hope we'll see all of you back here next month for that webinar. And have a beautiful rest of the day, everyone. Bye now.